Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, as Stephen mentioned, I'm going to be presenting some of the work that I've been doing as part of my postdoctoral research at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, Boston University, and the University of Pittsburgh, sponsored in large part by the National Science Foundation. I'm going to be talking today about how tree wildflower phenological mismatch differs across continents and in response to spring warming. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with eastern temperate forests, and specifically temperate deciduous forests in the eastern United States and Canada, this is what early spring looks like often, where we have, where the canopy trees have not yet leafed out, and so we have a relatively open canopy with a lot of light coming through. This is a really important resource for understory wildflower species and other understory plants, such as juvenile trees, shrubs, basically anything that isn't already in the canopy. And this represents a really valuable resource for these plants, which can then use this light to assimilate a lot of carbon in a relatively short amount of time. These plants try to time their phenology, so their leaf out and flowering, in order to make maximum use of this light availability, while also trying to reduce risk from damage from late spring frost events and other sorts of early seasonal hazards, such as increased herbivory and things of that nature. So they try to thread this needle between not leafing out too early, but also leafing out early enough to make use of this high spring light availability. To this end, they tend to leaf out days or weeks earlier than the canopy and sequester the majority of their total annual carbon during a period that is often only 2 to 4 weeks long. This strategy is referred to in the literature as phenological escape, and or spring light window duration, things of that nature, and has been shown to be a really valuable part of the biology of these species. Once the canopy closes in late spring and early summer, many of these spring species, or spring ephemeral species as they're often called, will then retreat underground and senesce their leaves and hold on to whatever carbon they were able to sequester in again, what is a 2 to 3 week period typically. This has been shown to be a really important resource. So Heberlein et al. In 2019 showed in their work with spring wildflower species that many of these species assimilate over 50% of their annual carbon within the first few weeks of the growing season before canopy closure, which is represented here by this gray shading in the middle. And some species that leaf out later in the growing season even make use of a second light availability window here in fall as well. For some of the work that I did for my PhD at the University of Michigan, I was looking at understory tree seedlings. So Acer saccharum is sugar maple, Quercus rubra is in yellow. And what I found is that the earlier these seedlings leafed out, so the further on this x-axis, the further left on this x-axis indicates earlier leaf out, that they had the higher total annual assimilation that they had. So this includes both summer and fall, but we saw a really strong signal in terms of the earlier you leaf out, the more carbon you're able to sequester. This had really important implications for the growth and survival of these species. So this here is looking at survival curves for sugar maple, again in blue, and Quercus rubra in yellow. And we found that the higher amount of carbon that they were able to assimilate, the more likely they were to survive to the following year. Importantly, climate change is expected to alter access to light availability in Eastern North America. So Heberlein et al. In another study published in 2019 showed that the sensitivity to spring temperature for canopy species, as shown in this with this black line here, is more sensitive than phenological sensitivity of the wildflower species in this dashed gray line. What that means is that for every degree of Celsius warmer in spring, trees were leafing out proportionally more earlier or proportionally earlier than the wildflower species were. So, and what that means in terms of availability of spring light. So you can basically think of the distance between these two lines as the duration of that spring light availability. So under cold spring conditions, that might be about 20 days here on the y-axis. But as spring is warm, the distance between those lines decreases. And so access to spring light for those understory wildflower species is also expected to decrease as well, or has already decreased, but is also expected to continue to decrease into the future. For my dissertation, I looked at something similar. So here, this green line is the canopy, and the red and blue lines are the oak and maple seedlings, respectively. And we see that the distance between these lines actually increases as we move to the right. So for the temperate tree seedlings, we would expect actually more access to spring light as temperatures warm in the future. So similar ideas with different species and different groups, but potentially separate trajectories depending on sensitivity to spring temperature. And so this is a relatively new framework to think about in terms of shifts in phenology in these temperate forests, and questions still remain. The main one that I'm going to focus on for the rest of this talk is if are spring light windows and climate change projected changes in those spring light windows consistent across other continents. So, and as well, looking at across North America too. And specifically, I'm going to be looking at if canopy tree leaf out responds to spring temperature the same way across different continents, if wildflower flowering responds to spring temperature in the same way across different continents, and if spring light windows, so the distance in time between those two dates, if those are expected to, or if those are different between continents, and if the changes in that duration of spring light window is expected to change, if the projected changes in spring light window duration are expected to change differently across those continents as well. So to give a little background about what we did, we used over 5,500 herbarium specimens collected across Eastern North America, Europe, and Eastern Asia, dating back to 1901. I really want to highlight that these specimens were assembled by 3 of my collaborators, so Tara Miller at Boston University, Christophe Roche at Martin Luther University, and Yan Yang at Nanjing Forestry University. And so they and their labs really were crucial in assembling this data set that I'm currently using. So huge thanks to them that I'm here today to be able to talk about it. They collected at least 6 tree species and 6 forb species on each continent. And the models that I'll be presenting today are based off of tree leaf out day and wildflower flowering. So we compared sensitivity to spring temperature for those 2 groups, wildflowers and trees, using a Bayesian linear modeling approach. This included a shared intercept along with spring temperature and elevation as the fixed effects, and this alpha term is a species level random effect in the model. I'm going to be mostly focusing today on the differences in spring temperature sensitivity, but I'll also briefly mention elevation here in the next slide. So jumping straight into the results, what you can see here in North America is that we found very similar effects to what Mason Heberling et al. Found in their 2019 paper, where tree leaf out was significantly more sensitive, so more negative, than the wildflower flowering dates. These are 95% Bayesian confidence intervals, so no overlap means that we interpret that as a statistically significant difference between those 2 estimates. And surprisingly, though, we found that there is no significant difference between these 2 groups in either Europe or Asia. So looking at the left. Importantly, we also see that there are no significant differences. So just looking at the blue circles here, there are no significant differences in wildflower flowering, but there was but trees in North America were significantly more sensitive to spring temperature compared to those in Europe and Asia as well. This is the posterior estimated means and 95% Bayesian confidence intervals for the elevation terms. I just want to point out that most of these are positive effects, where the higher elevation, the more delayed the phenology is. But if you have questions about this, I'd be happy to answer them later or via email. So to focus in on the main questions, though, North America is the only continent where tree and wildflower sensitivities are significantly different. So this is suggesting that this is the only continent for which we would expect a significant difference or a significant shift in this spring light window duration into the future. What is really interesting to me is that this shift seems to be driven primarily by differences in tree sensitivity to climate, where the North American trees are significantly more sensitive compared to the Asian and European trees. Since the wildflowers don't really differ, it suggests that it's the trees that are driving this difference, and that will be a cool sort of future area of research, I think, to figure out why that is. To compare this to some of the graphs I showed earlier, so this is North America here on the right, and with the tree leaf out in the gold line and the wildflower leaf out as this blue line. You can see in North America, as we move from cooler to warmer springs, we expect the distance between these lines, which represents the duration of spring light windows, to decrease. However, in Europe, here in the central panel, we see that these lines are more or less parallel, and we would expect, therefore, no difference in, or no change in the difference between these two lines as we move into warmer springs. And then in Asia here on this left panel, we see that the lines diverge as you go from left to right. And so we would expect under future warming in spring that wildflowers actually experience a slightly elevated duration of spring light availability. And just throwing this up in a sort of map form, here in these figures, the warmer red colors show projected increases in spring light window duration by the end of this current century, whereas the cooler blue colors show decreases or projected decreases in the duration of the spring light window. So we see very different patterns or predictions across these different continents, where North America is the most negative here, where we would expect strong decreases in access to light, especially in the northern part of North America. And then in Asia, especially, we see strong projected increases in spring light availability. And Europe is somewhere in the middle, where we don't expect it to change much at all. So just to throw up the conclusions really fast, this is a really short talk, but we see that wildflower phenology is similar among the continents. Tree phenology is significantly more sensitive in Eastern North America compared to in Europe and Asia. And we see that this results in differences in what we expect in the future in terms of how light availability is going to change in temperate forests on these three continents. Specifically, under projected warming, Eastern North American wildflowers will lose access to spring light, while those in Europe and Asia will gain or maintain access to that critical resource. Overall, this suggests that the performance of these spring wildflowers will respond differently to climate change, where presumably in Asia and to a certain extent Europe, you might expect some amount of increased performance that comes with increased carbon assimilation dynamics. However, in North America, where we expect decreases in access to light, we might also expect reductions in performance as well. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions. I'm also going to throw my email here up on the screen. So if you have any emails after the conference as well, I'd be happy to take those there.
Good afternoon. Some of you may wonder how spring phenology influences plant phenological responses. I hope you have answers soon. So all plants in Northern Hemisphere require certain accumulation of winter low chilling temperatures to break dormancy and accumulation of spring higher temperatures to initiate the new growth. This chilling forcing requirement vary among species and populations. And a higher temperature from climate change increase cumulative spring forcing and advance spring phenology through both quantity and rate of chilling accumulation. The influence of quantity is quite straightforward, and more warming and more phenological responses. But there seems to be quite misunderstanding on the rate effect. The rate refer to the accumulation of temperatures per day. The high rate, high temperatures are associated with high rate but low phenological responses, and low temperature associated with low rate but high phenological responses. This is just like a different dimension of square with a equal area. For the same amount of change in spring phenology from climate change, for example, 50 degree days of mean daily temperature above zero, early season species need to advance from April 21st to April 1st, about 20 days to accumulate 50 degree days, while late season species only need 9 days from May 10th to May 1st. Well, the difference is totally due to different temperatures, not species' ability to track temperature change. The idea very popular these days. Higher temperature can increase or decrease cumulative winter chilling. The change in winter chilling does not affect spring phenology when chilling requirements fully met. When chilling is inefficient, plants require more cumulative spring forcing to initiate a new growth. There have been strong interest in photoperiod effect control over spring phenology. I use question mark here as suggests that critical photoperiod have not been found yet. In general, photoperiod effect is variable and is much smaller than temperature effect. A longer photoperiod can compensate for some forcing requirements. Many reported photoperiod effect in the literature actually result from misinterpretation that only considered difference in timing, but while ignoring difference in temperatures. Based on the mechanism of spring phenology, 3 types of phenological model have been developed. Forcing, where chilling requirement not considered, or chilling requirement are fully met long before the accumulation of spring forcing. This type of model apply to the area with long cold winter, where chilling requirement is more than is sufficient to meet plant need. Second model is chilling forcing, that both chilling forcing requirement considered, but there are different hypotheses how chilling forcing accumulate. The third model is not consider chilling forcing as well as photoperiod. Next, we'll use this model, look at how plant responds in spring phenology to different different types of climate warming. First, let's look at hypothetical species and their responses to 2-degree uniform increase of 2018 and 19 temperatures in Sault Ste. Ontario. We assume chilling requirement met prior to January 1st, prior to the accumulation of spring forcing, which typically occur after March. This is the base of a forcing model, but likely true for the area of a long cold winter in Sault Ste. Marie. We calculate the average temperatures within a window of phenological shift. I call it leaf-out temperatures, which is the only temperature within the window of phenological shift. Of course, different plants have different phenology and also leaf-out temperatures. The 500 green degree hours represent very early species like grass, and 10,000 for late species like black spruce. And early species A and B show greater response in terms of phenological shift because of their low leaf-out temperatures. And here, effect of photo period, drought, or stress like other stress or insufficient chilling do not exist here. Everything caused by leaf-out temperatures. In a more complicated scenario where both chilling and forcing requirement are considered, I use species-specific phenological model developed in 9 climate zones in Canada, China, and UK. Within each zone, I use historical weather data from 9 to 12 locations to simulate how plant spring phenology respond to 2-degree uniform increase of baseline temperatures between 1981 and 2010. On the left, phenological change with generally decrease with increase of forcing requirements from early to late season species, except for cold China, the blue line, where such a relationship is not significant. On the right are the relationship between phenological response and leaf-out temperature, very similar to those on the left, suggesting that spring phenology influence plant phenological response basically through leaf-out temperatures. The third scenario are data synthesis with global observation and experiment. I compiled a 1,527 record from 66 studies at 87 locations for 980 species and related observed phenological changes to climate, phenological, and biological variables. I need to explain some of the variable here because it has not been, some of them now been used in the phenological research yet. The observed changes are what are actually reported in the literature in terms of number of days difference between control and warm treatment in warming experiment or between baseline and warmer period for observations. Expect changes are those based on the change in forcing temperatures from climate warming between control and warm group under the assumption of forcing models. The difference between expect and observed change reflect constraint of all factors that may include insufficient chilling for the period, drought, or other stresses. Well, as been seen earlier, leaf-out temperature is average temperature within a window of phenological shift. And species warming are the change in cumulative forcing temperatures accumulated at times of a new growth, that reflecting the total warming received by individual species at a time for new growth. And here, spring warming just average temperature change in spring. So for both leafing and flowering events, leaf-out temperatures, species warming, and phenological constraint are the most important. And phenological constraint has largest impact, but is negative, suggesting a general delay from what would be expected from change in forcing temperatures. That may include insufficient chilling, drought, or photoperiod effect. Leaf-out temperature and species warming have a similar effect, but different directions. More species warming, more phenological responses, and higher leaf-out temperature, smaller phenological changes. So consistent to the modeling effect, modeling result earlier. So I use leaf-out temperature here just for the both events, both leafing and flowering events, just for the convenient discussion of change in growth potential or growing season length next. Spring phenology influence plant phenological responses basically through temperatures. And higher temperatures associated with low responses and low temperature associated with higher responses. And shift in spring phenology associated with both changes in timing and forcing temperatures, and later is more indicative of spring development. We know that early season species may have greater change in timing, but a smaller change in forcing temperatures because they are early for early spring phenology and cumulative nature of spring temperatures. If forcing change in forcing temperatures occurring between early and late season species included, all species would have a similar change in forcing temperatures from climate warming. All species would be equally affected by the warming in terms of thermal benefit. There have been numerous speculation on the ecological implication of differential phenological responses among different species or different areas. For example, early season species, including early successional and invasive species, have greater change in spring phenology in response to climate warming. They are believed more capable of tracking temperature changes and gaining growth and competitive advantage over late season species, and therefore resulting in altered ecosystems structure and function. This speculation and hypothesis not supported by mechanism spring phenology are likely incorrect. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephen and friends, for giving me this opportunity to present my work the last 3 years here in Mexico. Apologize with my English, like you use Spanish. It's very complicated to me. But if we have some friends speak Spanish in the room, please help me with maybe some words or some phrases. The title of this work is Drought Mistletoe Infestation in High Mountain Forests here in Mexico. Oh, sorry.
You're muted again, Angel. Yeah, so you just need to unmute and then you can start again at this slide. Yeah, just hit the mute button at the bottom left of your screen, I think.
Okay.
That's good now.
Now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I have a really bad connection internet here in my work. Okay, the high mountain forest here in Mexico usually is established above from 3,500 meters above sea level. These forests usually are dominated by a population of Pinus harvigii, and this species is adapted to low temperature condition, and it's possible to find above to 4,000 meters. Okay, Pinus harvigii grows under cold condition, close to the tree line, but in the down, the down of this population is associated with other species, pine, and fir, alder, and oak. The population of Pinus harvigii here in Mexico and Guatemala is the biggest population in both countries, and little in Honduras. My study area is the volcanic trans-Mexican system, where we can find the most high volcanic system in Mexico, like Pico de Orizaba, Nevado de Toluca, Monte Tlaloc, Nevado de Colima, for example. This is some pictures about these mountains. It's beautiful mountains and beautiful forests. Well, these forests, obviously, we have many problems, especially with anthropogenic and natural factors of disturbance, like land use change, reduction in forest area, increased pest infestation, increase of temperature, wildfires, and wood extraction. This disturbance have influenced the forest structure and forest composition. And we have, and now we have a very problems with, especially with mistletoes and bark beetle. Especially two species of mistletoes, like Arcetobium vaginatum and Arcetobium globosum, black and yellow. And we have in 5 mountains by the moment in here in Mexico. These 5 mountains are Nevado de Colima, Nevado de Toluca, Monte Tlaloc, Pico de Orizaba, and Cofre de Perote. We have obtained the map of the mountain, were determined by INEGI here in Mexico. And we use the minimum sampling intensity was calculated by Bolford. And distribution of plot sampling use the method of transects and the forest inventory. And this with both methods, we can establish close to 2,600 plot sampling in all mountains. Every plot sampling is 1,000 meters. Is a circle. When we measure all regeneration and adult trees in this circle. And especially we are putting attention with mistletoes, and this is the classic method of measure the individual with mistletoes. And the data analysis with the mapping and structure is very interesting. And now we show the results of this work. For example, Nevado de Toluca, we have close to 47% of the surface of the forest with this problem. We think it's very high, and I hope so. These maps could use by the government to establish methods of control of this pathogen. And Cofre de Perote, we have close to 30% of the forest with mistletoes. Pico de Orizaba, we have close to 30% to the forest with this problem. And we have here other problem associated to the forest, like organized crime. We cannot to enter to the forest because the forest is so sorry. Steph, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay. And I hear other people. Okay. And I hear other people talking. Steph.
I only hear you.
Okay.
So
Okay, no problem. And I hear other people speaking. Okay, sorry. And continue. And Pico de Orizaba close to 30%. But I was talking about the organized crime because it's some places it's not possible to work because the forest now here in Mexico, or in some natural protected areas, is controlled by the crime organized. And Monte Tlaloc is close to 30%, like the other mountains, and I think it's a real problem. Talking about this with other friends, other forest friends, we think that is very high, these surfaces, and we need to do something. And finally, Nevado de Colima is less to 20% the surface with mistletoes. Only one species, Arcetobium vaginatum, and here the real problem is bark beetle, but we don't have the map. And what happened with the horizontal structure? No? For example, this is the horizontal structure with all trees with mistletoes. You can see the cofre de perote is we have a lot of individuals and in the little diameter class, but if we use only the health individuals, you can see, and we have several damage with the little categories of diameter class, and particularly in Cofre de Perote and Monte Tlaloc. What happened with the infestation level? If we take the sick trees, we have a high level infestation in all categories, including the regeneration. And what happened with trees per hectare in the 5 mountains? We have especially attention with Cofre Perote and Monte Tlaloc. Why this special attention? Because we use the tendency of climate and the last 40 years in this study area. We can find that Monte Tlaloc and Cofre Perote has the high increase of the temperature. Now, 1.1 and 0.9 in Monte Tlaloc and Cofre Perote, I think is very high. And maybe this is the reason why we have many individuals sick in Cofre Perote and Monte Tlaloc. And we can to do. Now we are using the mistletoe to food on the cattle. We are looking some areas with a possible genetic resistance, and we are working with biological control with some species of fungi. Maybe this is the strategies management to this forest to reduce the off-level infestation of mistletoes. And thank you so much to my whole team. I'm so sorry by my English staff and friends. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, so I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors also with the PNW Research Station. We've been working on providing summaries for the West Coast states on carbon status and trends for a few years now, and this is the development of some of that work. So, of course, why is there so much interest in carbon? Well, carbon dioxide is increasing in the atmosphere, and actually that rate of increase is accelerating in recent decades. So even though fossil fuel combustion is responsible for 78% of US emissions, in the US at least in recent years, the sequestration of forests has been reducing that emission by 12%. However, there's the expectation that that forest sink will decline over time as forests primarily in the eastern US age, and particularly if wildfire increases, which is more of a concern on the West Coast. So there's always a lot of interest when we have a big fire year, a big drought. What was the effect of that disturbance through these years, that type of disturbance on forest carbon stores and sequestration? So I'm going to talk about some of the approaches to answering that question and introduce an approach that's mostly focused on field measurements, and then discuss some of the trends that we've found looking at that. So one of the common approaches is to go to remote sensing to quantify the impact of disturbance. So this is an image of, or a model, I should say, of biomass in forests in the Oregon Coast Range. This is the Willamette Valley here, agricultural lands, and this is the rangelands of Eastern Oregon here. And wildfire events in 2020 driven by an event that tore across the mountain range in these fires here. So in order to estimate the impact of the fire, you need to know what was there beforehand. And so here we have these fire polygon outlines, and we know what was there beforehand. We can make an estimate of what happened within there. You could either apply a combustion factor for those fires itself, or you can use a remote sensing layer on fire intensity, in this case MTBS, to estimate how hot the fire burned or what kind of impact it had within these different areas. So then you're taking a model of biomass and you're adding a model of fire severity, and then you're adding a model that estimates the amount of biomass that's killed and consumed by those different fire severities. And so you're stacking all these different models on top of each other, and the question is, how accurate is your estimate coming out the other end? So I've been working in inventory for a long time, and so my interest is to try to squeeze as much as possible from actual field data and see if we can answer the same kinds of questions. This is a portion of the U.S. National Inventory. These are the plots in green on forest land across the West Coast. And the beauty of this sample is that we use we're taking measurements on all lands. We have nationally consistent protocols which allow comparability across regions. We're measuring multiple data attributes on permanent plots. So we're actually tracking individual trees over time. And then something that's very important to our private landowners is that the identity of the plots and the owners is confidential, but all the other data are publicly available for use by anyone. So on the West Coast, the plots are measured on a 10-year cycle. And what that means is, so for each panel year, we split all our plots into 10 panels that are spread representatively across the state. And each year we measure 1/10 of those, 2002 till we get to 2010, and then we start over. We start with the first panel and remeasure that. So in our standard compilation, what that means is that we're measuring the difference or the change on a plot that was measured in 2001 and 2011, and we're doing the same for the other panels as well. And then you could use just one panel to estimate for the change on for the whole state, but the variance would be quite high, and your ability to drill into species and landowner types would be very low. So generally what we do is we lump together as many panels as we can, and then our calculation becomes an average estimate of annual carbon flux, for example, by pool or ownership, with the first measurement in the 2000s and the second measurement in the 2010s. And this is a standard approach we use for our state reports and our West Coast carbon assessments. Another approach, though, is to use whatever the most recent measurement of these plots are, and say we're interested in what the status was in 2016, or the most recent year we have Landsat change detection for example. And then we look at the disturbance and project those plots forward to that date. But a key part is that you also need growth models. Landsat is not very good. It's very good at detecting disturbance. It's not very good at detecting growth in intact mature forests. Or you could use stage transition matrices, which assume that your transitions that were measured in previous years go forward. And so this is an approach that's used in our National Carbon Assessments and Resource Planning Act reports. But another way that uses very little projection and modeling is to look at a particular year. Say 2012 here was a big fire year, and look at the plots where we have remeasurement that spans those different years and say what was happening in that year and for those plots. So one of the challenges, of course, is that there's a lot going on a particular plot between time 1 and time 2, and with the fire in between. There's growth, mortality, cutting, and decomposition happening before a fire event. Then you have the fire emitting combustion, and then the same things happening afterwards. Fortunately for this inventory, though, we have crews that are estimating when the disturbances occurred and when the mortality and cutting occurred on every plot. Unfortunately, we don't have that for growth. We just have the trees that were alive. And so the growth, we have an average annual estimate over time. So I'm going to provide some examples here of what this looks like when you look at change over time. And so here for the state of California, we have the area disturbed by cause. And so you can see some peaks here in fire years, 2008, and big fire years here, 2018. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we haven't been able to complete all of our most recent plots. So our data are limited to 2019, but 2019 and 2020 and 2021 in particular were big fire years in California. So as soon as those data come in, that will become more apparent. So clearly in terms of disturbance, fire is a big one in California. Here's this drought year in 2016, a lot of mortality from weather, and cutting tends to be quite a bit lower. In contrast, in Oregon, the cutting level is quite a bit higher. Insect and disease impacts, mortality tends to be quite a bit higher than fire. But we had this big fire year in 2017, and then 2020 and 2021 would also sort of go off the graph, off the chart here, if we had that data. Washington, the cutting tends to be a little bit higher. What's interesting is that during the recession here, I remember hearing that the industrial owners actually increased their rate of logging to keep their cash flow level, even though the price of logs had dropped, the level of cutting actually increased to cover that difference in value. So some interesting patterns emerging in some of the data. So if we go from area to start looking at tree mortality, and this is looking at California, but broken out by different ownerships. Federal protected, these are wilderness national parks, federal non-protected, private corporate, private non-corporate. And some of the things that jump out are the fire effects in red are much higher on federal lands than they are on private lands. Interestingly, the insect and disease effects are higher on the unprotected lands, the federal unprotected lands and the Federal Reserve, which tend to be at higher elevations. And so they weren't affected by the drought quite as much as the unprotected lands. The private corporate lands, it's interesting that, you know, there tends to be a lot less mortality because there's active harvesting going on those lands. But suppression tends to be a much bigger part of the mortality picture than in other ones. And then the private non-corporate in California tends to be on the valley margins, the lower elevations, and they were much greater affected by the drought seen here in the white that happened in the 2015 and 2016. So now if we bring in the cutting as well as the mortality and look at growth, and again, the growth is averaged to some extent, but in these years, there's the plots that were measured early and remeasured early, and then they kind of drop out as you get to the plots that were remeasured later. So we're still seeing a trend in growth, and it tends to be declining. And you can see that the mortality is exceeding growth in several of the years here, and especially if you include cutting for live trees anyways, it suggests that we're seeing a decrease in our live tree pool over time. Oregon, the picture is quite different. Growth rates also seem to be declining over time, but generally above cutting and mortality for most years. And the same is true here for Washington. So we can do the same thing and look at species level effects. And so I've got some examples here, subalpine fir in Oregon, where the mortality has basically exceeded growth in almost all the years in the record here. Western hemlock, where it's a little bit more variable, but growth levels tend to be lower in relation to mortality and cutting. And then Douglas fir, the big tree for Oregon, where growth tends to be quite a bit higher and seems to be fairly stable. Not a lot of trends seen in our data set so far in terms of that tree. But if we zero in, if we look at California and look at the drought effects here, we can see some significant effects where ponderosa pine and sugar pine had some really high mortality rates and quite a bit higher than their growth rates. Not quite as significant in red fir, which is a higher elevation species, but you can still see some impact here in mortality during the big drought years. And just an idea of the overall significance of that, where we saw 30% declines in the biomass of these two pines over that 10-year period. So of course, that's just part of the picture, is just the tree mortality. Obviously, in a fire, when your trees die, you get a decrease in live trees, but an increase in dead trees. So this just looks at how the different pools change across these different disturbance categories. So we're hoping to bring in more of these other pools in addition to the live tree in future analysis. And I'll just make a pitch here in terms of, here's some estimates of different studies that have used the remote sensing modeling approach versus our measurement. And here's one for the rim fire that estimated really high losses in that fire, whereas our net change over time is quite a bit lower. It turns out in their LiDAR approach, they kind of censored out snags and missed that pool that was still there on the ground. So that seems to be explaining that difference there. So I think I'm low on time. Overall, though, you know, in terms of our net change, seems to be lining up fairly well with some other estimates of combustion. So in conclusion, our approach was able to pick out annual patterns of mortality and harvest that varied among states, owners, and ecoregions, with distinct patterns for fires, suppression, drought, and wind effects. And the standard FIA net change on burns provides representative estimates of short-term fire impacts based on actual field measurements, although you know, combustion is in there somewhere. And I wonder if maybe that's better, just you know, to have an estimate of the fire effect that isn't specifically combustion, but it's actually based on ground measurements. Interestingly, there were trends of declining growth evident for all West Coast states and for several species in particular. And just to shout out that some recent work has been incorporating tree core information on growth rates with climate to improve the annual resolution of tree growth. And with that, if there's any time, I'll be happy to take any questions and make a pitch for really great jobs. Need a lot of people out there measuring this stuff. So if you know anyone looking for a job, send them our way. Thanks.
I'm going to talk a little bit about forest change in the eastern US. And first, I want to mention my co-authors and postdoc mentors, Chris and Tara, because they've been tremendously helpful and are a huge part of this project. They're responsible for all of the positive and good ideas you're about to hear about, and any mistakes are fully my own. So I just want to start off with that. I can't say good enough things about both of them. So broadly, we're exploring factors that impact mesophication as it relates to change in functional composition at the stand and the watershed scale. So there's a growing body of evidence that kind of more mesic tree species are increasing in importance across much of the eastern US. This is an example of that. We have good evidence that this increase in the abundance and importance of these species often occurs alongside a decrease in the importance of more disturbances adapted, more xeric, kind of associated with drier conditions species. So in other words, those that we think of as intolerant or mid-tolerant to shade, including kind of ecologically and economically valuable oak species in particular. So for example, just to give you some more examples of this, between 1980 and 2005, Fay and Steiner reported increases in the relative importance of a really common mesic shade tolerant species, so red maple. I think we're all pretty familiar with that. And their results suggest that this increase in red maple abundance is occurring in the majority of states in this region. In particular, it's greatest in the western portion of the eastern US. No states actually that they looked at experienced significant decreases in red maple abundance during this period. And they also found that red maple density increased in all diameter classes across this region. So it's a pretty consistent trend. And the authors conclude that some of the current land use and forest management practices may also be related to this. But we in general see this large increase in red maple. And concern over this transition, so this general trend that we're seeing and transition of the composition of our forests, concern over this is related to several factors, including the potential that this transition is self-reinforcing. So that's normally what we think of when we think of the term mesophication. It's related to the self-reinforcing aspect of this transitional change. I'm going to use that term a little bit more broadly just for simplicity and use it to relate to the overall functional change. But essentially, mesophication is this shift from more mesic to more xeric species. And it refers to a suite of processes that are kind of interlinked with this compositional shift. So it creates these conditions that promote the continued establishment of these mesic species. So again, for time, I might not spend too much time on this, but it can potentially be self-reinforcing due to conditions that are created in the understory. So things like increased humidity and decreased radiation when you get these more mesic species in the overstory, a less flammable little litter layer. And this process could result in a seed bed that's kind of more conducive to germination, establishment, and growth of these mesophytic species. So there's concern that once they become established in the overstory, this is going to be a condition that is maintained across the landscape. This matters for a couple reasons. So there's some functional traits associated with this suite of species that result in changes in some of these ecosystem functions that we would potentially be concerned about. So things like timber production, nutrient cycling, cultural services. So things like decreased forest flammability, decreasing the efficacy of prescribed fire, reduced water yield, huge impacts on potential wildlife habitat, particularly in terms of oak and hickory that provide really important food resources. Also, potentially, this could result in decreased variation in communities, forest communities across the landscape. So decreasing differences in these communities across this landscape kind of results in an homogenized condition. So there is some debate about the importance of various factors that may be causing this, whether it's self-reinforcing, relationship between climate change and fire exclusion. And I'm focusing less on potential drivers and more on where we potentially see these differences in this change. So we saw earlier that there's pretty good evidence that it's occurring across in terms of broad scale, the eastern US. But questions remain about the local factors that might be impacting sort of the rate, how quickly this is happening, and the degree of this change, mesophication. We have some information about this variation in the rate of this change at the stand level, but this evidence is often limited to particular forest types or potential landscape positions and can be somewhat localized. And in some cases, we even see conflicting evidence. So for example, from Ohio, we see some evidence that whether you're in a more mesic position, so kind of a cove or up on a ridge, we don't see a drastic difference potentially in whether mesophication is more severe. But in another example, so for an Appalachian old growth forest, we see that there is some variation there. So we see in more mesic areas, decreased recruitment of some of these species, changes in this community composition. So essentially is greater in these mesic areas. So there is potential evidence for both topography being important in some areas versus not. And so we have questions about where we see this change. So in terms of things like factors associated with site quality, so soil characteristics, topographic variables, forest cover type, land ownership, so some relationship to history of behavior, stand characteristics like stand age and how variable diameters are. And this is important to better understand response at a finer scale. And when we say fine scale, we mean looking at potentially stand or watershed level scale. So we can maybe better inform management and action in terms of where we potentially think mesophication will be more severe. I'm going to be very brief in terms of my methods. I'm happy to chat more about what I did. But I essentially used FIA data to address this question. So I looked at tree level data across the eastern US. I used community weighted means to look at functional changes associated with mesophication. We evaluated this shift based on the rate, so change through time, and also based on what we call degree, but is comparing the overstory versus the understory, or the midstory really in this case, to get a sense of potential future change. So for our functional traits, again, I mentioned we're looking at fire, shade, and drought tolerance. In short, shade and drought tolerance that I used are very similar to what we normally expect using the tri-trait database. The fire trait metric or fire adaptation that I used in this case is a little bit different, where it's accumulation of various fire traits to give us a better sense of a suite of potential adaptations to fire. So this metric looks at fire resistance and fire tolerance, in addition to things like grass stage, just to get an overall idea of the sense of how good a particular tree species is at responding to fire in a variety of ways, is the short version. Happy to talk more about that. And our predictors for our general linear models, we looked at physiographic class, so a suite of FIA-derived variables. We also used the Surgo soil database, and we used actual plot locations to associate these particular plots with these fine scale variables using GIS. So these are general linear models with a Gaussian distribution. While some of these metrics probably are bounded, we didn't have any issues in terms of our diagnostic plots and overall looking at these models. And again, happy to talk more about that. So focused on these various suites of predictors at the stand and watershed scale. So to get into some of what we found, we first looked at just in general the different provinces across the area. And I'm showing you a graph right now that shows the three different metrics. So these are community weighted means again in columns. So you have going left to right, drought, fire, and shade tolerance. And then the rows represent those two different ways of evaluating potential change through time. So degree again being the overstory in comparison to the midstory, and then rate, so that lower row representing actual change through time of tree species. And so we see in general, these points that are above the dashed line represent evidence of mesophication. So that represents either decreased drought and decreased fire tolerance or increased shade tolerance through time or compared midstory versus overstory. And we see with degree that in general, we have strong evidence for this process occurring. Rate, that's also true, but there's some variation by province. But overall, the takeaway is, regardless of whether you look at drought, fire, or shade tolerance, you do see evidence for this shift. Comparing owner group, we didn't necessarily see as consistent of a pattern. So you can see various owner groups here based on color, and we're looking at a similar setup in terms of our results, so degree and then rate and drought, fire, and shade. I'm generally focusing on oak hickory forest here. I include some results from oak pine because those are the main forest types that we generally think of in terms of looking at this trend. And I had to, at some point, reduce the data that I could talk about. But in general, we don't see drastic differences between owner group here. We do find limited evidence that this mesophication process is lower in privately and indigenously owned forests, in particular based on drought and shade tolerance. And we see some evidence as well that state locally owned forests may be lower based on shade and shade tolerance, in particular in comparison to Forest Service owned lands. In general, this was a little bit less variable than we expected. We also looked at physiographic group. So this is a FIA metric that compares kind of that wet to dry mesic to xeric trend across the landscape. We see here that mesophication, so this is an interesting one. It was generally more pronounced in wetter sites. So we also looked at available water holding capacity. And when you just look at the more mesic and xeric topography classes here, so the green and red, but plots categorized as hydric were often highly variable. So if you compare particularly drought here, we see in terms of degree, in general, hydric plots were had greater evidence of mesophication, but much lower evidence of that in terms of rate, so that actual change through time. So this is kind of an interesting trend. But overall, in comparison to the mesic and hydric, which were much more common in our data set, we see overall evidence of greater mesophication in those more mesic plots. We also looked at a couple of those stand level variables. So this is coefficient of diameter. So essentially how variable are the diameters or the tree sizes in a particular stand. These results look very similar to stand age as well. So this represents our strongest relationship with these two variables in general. And in this case, with stand age and variability of diameters, we see increased evidence of mesophication with increasing stand age and increasing variation in diameters. Some of this could be, in terms of normal expectations of succession, but it's an interesting trend overall in comparison to a few of the others. And finally, I know I'm short on time, we also did find some evidence that forest type did impact some of these relationships. So the effect size and direction of the relationship of change in the community weighted mean. And this is with pH in terms of soil. So the relationship between this and pH kind of varied depending on which functional trait was examined, with shade tolerance suggesting mesophication is most pronounced at low pH sites, and drought and fire tolerance suggesting this relationship may sometimes be dependent on forest type. So here we actually see two different forest types based on the green and the blue line. So you have oak pine forest in the green and the oak hickory in the red, or in the blue, excuse me. So overall, just quick summary. I need to start thinking a little bit more about this. There's a lot more results from these models, and I'm happy to chat more about it. But we did find some interesting results. We somewhat postulated that this process of mesophication would be more pronounced in mesic sites where we would expect higher soil moisture. We found some evidence of that, although it was somewhat variable. When we think of these more mesic conditions, though, we also think of somewhat more productive sites, those we associate with higher pH. And we didn't necessarily find that in higher pH sites, we saw greater evidence of mesophication. Red maple may partly be responsible for this because it's by far the most common mesic species across the region. And there's some evidence that it's associated with some of these lower pH condition sites. So a little bit more work needs to be done to tease out some of that relationship. And hopefully this work can help managers begin to prioritize areas that may be most susceptible to this process, particularly if they're concerned about a particular functional metric, such as drought tolerance given climate change or particular susceptibility to fire. So various aspects of their management regimes. Couple people to thank, lots of work, and for having an amazing FIA data set to allow us to ask these questions. I just want to take a minute to thank the, I'm sure, thousands of people who've been associated with that, but also Tara and Chris. And hopefully I'm not too far on time, but I'll leave that for questions.